Hello and welcome, or welcome back to the Import Export Hub channel, everybody. Bogdan here, your host for the next 10 minutes or so. Thanks for joining me, by the way. And guys, without anything else to add here, allow me to dive into the trade dynamics between the United States and Canada. And more precisely, I've prepared a list with the top 20 headings that had the largest changes in 2024 relative to the previous years. So 2023, both positive and negative. While towards the end of this video, I will also cover the imports with the smallest variability in an attempt to see where does Canada's comparative advantage resides, but more on this in a couple of minutes. So guys, in terms of absolute positive changes, on the first spot we see here Petroleum oils, headings 2709 with an absolute positive change of $6.1 billion and an overall import value of around $103 billion. Then we see heading 8802, so we are talking about powered aircraft with a positive change of almost $1.2 billion, while radioactive chemical elements, heading 2844, ends the podium with a change of some $795 million and an overall export value of $1.8 billion. And then the list goes on with, I don't know, chocolate and other food preparations, for example. What else do we see? We see bread, pastry, cakes, and the likes. So heading 1905 with an yearly positive change of what? $414 million. Live bovine animals is next with some $364 million positive change, while towards the end of this list we see copper with some $210 million positive change. New pneumatic tires sits on the 19th spot, while copper wire heading 7408 ends this top 20 list with almost $174 million positive change and an overall export value for 2024 of some $1.9 billion. So, looking at this data, what insights can we squeeze? Well, firstly, let's take a look at the summary chart here. And as we can clearly see, we have a lot of unique chapters, mostly with just one heading in this top 20 list. Then we see two clusters that are pretty important. The first one is chapter 85, so electrical machinery and equipment, with some three headings in this top 20 list, but a modest, if we can call $4.2 billion modest cumulative exports. And then the second cluster concerns chapters 88, 87, and 74, respectively, all with two headings each. And cumulative import values ranging, as you can see here, from, I don't know, $3.3 billion to some $8.7 billion. So definitely important, but not as important as chapter 27, so petroleum, when it comes to value. And we see here that with just one heading, we're seeing some $103 billion worth of imports from Canada. So this is one simple way at looking at the data with a little bit of structure. Now let's take a look at the compound annual growth rates for the last 5 years in order to see their dynamics in a broader time frame, and not just year over year. And surprise, surprise, all the headings in this top 20 list show positive figures, many of them with double-digit figures, so pretty impressive. And even though we now see this trade friction between the United States and the rest of the world, basically, trade won't stop. Yes, maybe some sourcing strategies will be reshuffled, some businesses will disappear, unfortunately, but trade won't stop. And just to give you a bird's eye view, if you want, on the trade flows, I've prepared for you a Sankey diagram with Canada's electric accumulators exports to the United States at a province/state level, and I think that this diagram speaks for itself really when it comes to how regions are connected by trade. And we clearly see how Ontario, for example, sends most of its its electric accumulators to Michigan, which it makes sense really, as we have the largest automotive manufacturing hub in the United States, if not for the entire North American continent right there. So what I'm trying to say is that trade connects businesses. It helps them compete on the world market, and it should be left to the market to decide how things unfold, and not for the government to intervene with tariffs, thinking that this is the way you're making the countries to pay for exporting their product, because this is totally wrong, guys. Importers pay, and ultimately the consumers in the importing country will pay more for the products that were imported. Anyways, guys, I'm not here for making policies, so I will now move to the top 20 headings that had the largest absolute negative changes in 2024. And on the first spot, we see motor cars, so heading 8703 with a contraction of some $6.5 billion, but still managing an impressive $28.4 billion in overall exports for 2024. Petroleum gas is on the second spot with a negative change of some $5.7 billion, while on the third spot, ending the podium, we have heading 7108. Gold basically with a contraction of almost $1.8 billion and an overall export value for 2024 around $4.5 billion. And then the list goes on with mineral or chemical potassic fertilizers, who has a negative change of almost $561 million. Unwrought nickel is also here, so heading 7502 with a contraction of almost $400 million. While towards the end of this top 20 list, we see flat rolled products of iron or non-alloy steel with a negative change of almost $239 million. Ferrous waste and scrap sits on the 19th spot. And here we see some $233 million negative change, while turbojets, turbopropellers, and other gas turbines, so heading 8411 ends the list with a contraction of $229 million and an overall export value for 2024 around $6.1 billion. And again, following the example from the previous sheet, what insights can we squeeze out of this information? Well, if we look at the summary chart, the number of unique chapters is slightly smaller, with one heading dominating in terms of breadth, and I'm talking here about chapter 84, which is mechanical and mechanical appliances, who has 5 headings in this top 20 list. While in terms of cumulative value, we're seeing that chapter 87, so vehicles, is dominating with some $28.4 billion worth of exports, which are generated by just one heading. I'm not going to cover the cluster involving petrol. Instead, I will point out the cluster involving precious metals, so chapter 71, who has 3 headings in this top 20 list. And besides the fact that gold is inherently prone to big volatilities, it somehow makes sense to see it here, as Canada, let's face it, guys, is a big producer and exporter of gold. As for the compound annual growth rates for the last 5 years, in this top 20 list, we see that only, 3 headings experienced negative changes, quite small and negligible, if you ask me. And looking at this data alone and not knowing the current context between Canada and the United States, I would be inclined to say that things are not looking bad. Commodity-related headings are volatile by definition, and we're seeing a lot of headings that are in this category here. But right now, I really don't know what to expect in terms of the trade dynamics between Canada and the United States. The volatility is expressing itself also in the U.S. Foreign policy, mostly there, if you ask me, with a lot of uncertainties. So I will stop here in making any predictions. But overall, let's say that I'm positive, and it will be really, really dumb for the United States to cut ties or reshuffle its supply chains with Canada. So, with this being said, guys, let's take a look at the last sheet that I've prepared for you, one in which I've calculated the coefficient of variation for each heading. Sorting this list from the smallest coefficient of variation to the largest one, and keeping only the top 20 headings in an attempt to find the sectors where Canada has a comparative advantage in terms of its exports towards the United States. And as we can see together here, the covert heading 9999, so commodities not elsewhere specified, had the smallest coefficient of variation, 0.025 to be exact, and given the nature of this heading, it's not helping us in identifying a particular sector, but I don't know, it made it in this top 20 list, so I had to include it. On the second spot, we see inorganic acids with a coefficient of variation of 0.0305. While on the third spot, we see acrylic polymers in primary forms with a coefficient of variation of 0.0335 and an overall export value of some $195 million for 2024. Then we see chlorates and perchlorates with a coefficient of variation of 0.0346. Machinery for working rubber or plastics follows. And here we see a coefficient of variation of 0.0419 and an overall export value of some $455 million. Towards the middle of this top 20 list, we see quicklime with a coefficient of variation of 0.0486. Undernaturated ethyl alcohol is next, and here we have a coefficient of variation of almost 0.051 and some $122.5 million worth of exports in 2024. While towards the end of this list, we see preparations for use on the hair, who sits on the 18th spot. Heading 8529 is next with a coefficient of variation of 0.0581, while telephone sets, including smartphones also, so heading 8517, ends this top 20 list with a coefficient of variation of 0.0591 and an overall export value of some $1 billion. And guys, quickly looking at this list when it comes to Canada's exports towards the United States and ignoring the covert chapter 99, we see a cluster of 3 headings emerging, and I'm talking here about chapter 25, which is responsible for earths and stone, plastering materials, lime and cement. And then we see 3 clusters with 2 headings each, and I'm talking about chapter 28, inorganic chemicals. In this case, chapter 39 is on the the second one, which is responsible for plastics and articles thereof. And last but not least, we have chapter 85, so electrical machinery and equipment. And I don't know if you agree with me or not, guys, but it manages to capture at least part of Canada's overall comparative advantages, even though here we're talking about Canada's exports towards the United States. And in order to support my argument, I've added Canada's overall exports. And if we're looking at the summary chart here for Canada's exports towards the whole world, we see that both chapter 39 and 84 are here. As for the compound annual growth rates for the last 5 years, well, we see just 5 headings with negative figures, low-end figures, so nothing worrying. But unfortunately, guys, we are seeing the same low figures on the positive side, meaning that in the last 5 years at least, we didn't see a big positive change either for these headings. So if were to look out for possible growth pole in terms of Canada's exports towards the United States, definitely it is not in this top 20 list. So guys, with this being said, I don't want to take more of your time. Hopefully some of you would have made it until now. Thanks for watching. I hope you've liked it. Don't forget to hit those small vanity buttons below this video. And as usual, until next time, keep your business safe. Thanks.